Hello everybody, welcome to the channel and another video. I recently took possession of an old Pedro Kantor that I decided I wanted to repaint. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to look into why Pedro is actually my favourite chapter master model that exists. Sorry, Dante.
It's what you're doing, making me feel like I'm falling. And when you're moving, I can hear my calling.
So today, once again, the painting is secondary to the story, the narrative that we're going to talk through. And I thought it'd be good to speak through who Pedro Kantor is and why I like him so much. So let's begin. So if you don't know already, Pedro Kantor is the 29th chapter master of the Crimson Fists, which are easily one of the coolest chapters in the lore. Second founding Sons of Dawn have a monopoly on some of the best chapters. As far as Marines go, and especially compared to people like Dante, he's actually fairly young at a nice spry 350 Terran years old. His personality is not too different from that of other Space Marine chapter masters, but he differs in that he's not really driven by glory or vengeance. He's more friends with the Salamanders in that he places his duty to the Emperor and the people of the Imperium above his own ideals. Now obviously he's still a transhuman warlord, but, you know, one with a heart. He's always kitted out in his artificer armor and carrying Dawn's arrow, which is the awesome storm bolter he's pointing out ahead of him, and he's also got, classically for the Crimson Fists, a power fist. The war gear is probably the main reason I really like the model, and it's just because it exemplifies what a Crimson Fist is. He's got a giant red right hand, no Peaky Blinders jokes, please, and a storm bolter, which is one of the coolest weapons that a Space Marine can have. It's a bolter ×2. Plus he's got a big belt of ammo going back to his power pack, which at the time of the model being released, he was basically the only one who had something like that. His pose is also perfect. He's leaning into firing his weapon, which is excellent, but he's also in that pose where you can't quite tell if he's about to advance or if he's standing steady, which, to be honest, is perfect for a Son of Dawn. His big power fist splayed out behind him gives him a really dynamic pose, and every time I see the model, it just gives me that nice blast of nostalgia from seeing him in White Dwarf years ago. So nostalgia and those rose-tinted glasses are probably playing into this in a big way. He's also one of the few modern chapter masters to be wearing a back banner. Azrael was just released and he managed to keep his, so that's excellent, and Castle and Crow was out a couple of years ago and he kept his too. But if they ever redo Pedro and they get rid of the banner, I'm going to riot, because the banner is epic. It's a silly idea, but if you think about his history, it's perfect for this character. Before we go into that history, you've just got to think about the Rogue Trader box art with the Crimson Fists on it. They're all standing, piled up in a final stand, some of them lying down, all firing into a crowd of Xenos. There are banners flying and fluttering, and to be honest, it's probably a great example of what Rin's world looked like. And as a result, it would be chaos, so the fact that Pedro has a big banner on his back saying, "Hey, I'm here," is an excellent rallying cry for his brothers, because if there's one thing that the Crimson Fists do better than anyone else, it's rally. So let's speak about the big moment in Kantor's life, the thing that really we know him for, and that's the defense of Rin's world. So prior to the disaster that was to come, Rin's world was a very peaceful agri-world, which is rare. Not being an agri-world, but being peaceful. It also happened to boast the fortress monastery of the Crimson Fists. So it was their chapter planet. Much like the Blood Angels have Baal, the Crimson Fists had Rin's world. In 989 Millennia 41, so about 300 years before the stories of the Indomitus Crusade, an orc warlord known as Snagrod began a massive orc war. Seeing them head towards Rin's world, the third company of the Crimson Fists were deployed to stall the war a few planets along the system in order to gauge its strength. And unfortunately for the Crimson Fists, the Imperial intelligence had failed and completely underestimated how large this force of orcs was. As a result, only a few Astartes of the third company actually managed to escape and relay that to the chapter master. Our big man Pedro recalled everybody, every Crimson Fist available to come and defend the chapter planet. As the master of the fortress and therefore the world, he set about organising the defences of the planet to meet the expected greenskin assault. However, as the orcs were just touching down on the planet, disaster struck. In a tragic case of friendly fire, a missile launched by one of the planetary defense installations struck the Crimson Fist's own fortress monastery. I mean, that literally cannot have gone worse for them. The missile's warhead, which was designed to penetrate void shields and heavy void ship armor of Gloriana-class battleships, instead leveled the monastery, killing 600 Crimson Fists. That's out of almost 1,000, and leaving just over a dozen survivors. Luckily for our story today, Kantor was one of them. He led his ragged band of survivors across the planet, through the war, through the War, to reach another detachment of around 400 Crimson Fists, everything that was left of the chapter. This consisted of elements of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd companies, all of them veterans, and they were assigned to defend the capital, New Rin City. It took them 10 days through a landscape choked with orc warbands to reach this detachment. They had only travelled at night, daylight being too dangerous. In the daytime, they were seeking shelter wherever they could, whether that's against the ruins of a farm or in an abandoned quarry. However, they were frequently found and had to fight their way out. On the 10th day, Pedro and his warband managed to make it to New Rin City. However, half of the Crimson Fists who had embarked on the journey never survived to reach the city. Those that did were wounded, weary, and covered with the blood of slain orcs. Now, despite this setback, despite losing almost 2/3 of the chapter on the first day of the invasion, fighting their way across the planet to a beleaguered force of fists holding the capital, Pedro then took control and managed to hold off the orcs for a further 18 months. After these 18 months, as the city was pushed further in upon itself, Imperial reinforcements finally arrived and managed to save the Crimson Fist from utter destruction. Despite being saved, for the next 200 years, the Crimson Fists were so depleted they could only deploy in infiltration-sized squads. Now, despite being small in number, these squads are veteran experts in fighting orcs, and naturally, as a result of what happened, have a hatred of the Xenos race. I love this particular story about Rinsworld because it's very 1980s, 1990s Games Workshop. Loads of brightly coloured green orcs, including Gargants, which we haven't heard about for a long time, running directly into a Space Marine chapter planet and messing it up. Some of the best stories from my childhood, sorry to make anyone feel old, but the 3rd and 4th edition codices, are about Marines holding off against unassailable odds, where really any human would have fallen long before. And the Crimson Fists, with Pedro specifically at their head, are undeniably some of the best at this type of warfare. Dawn would be proud. Plus, as an aside, he's got one of the coolest names of any chapter master, Pedro Kantor. And he's got a paint named after him. I know having a paint named after you isn't like the biggest thing, but I can't think of right now off the top of my head, and I'm sure you guys will correct me, of any other chapter master who has a paint named specifically after him. So, Pedro wins. If we jump ahead a tad in the lore now to the era Indomitus, basically we find the Crimson Fists starting to get back on their feet when the Great Rift tears open very close to Rinsworld and demons invade. Things go south very quickly as the Crimson Fists are, as always, outnumbered and besieged upon their homeworld. 3 times Pedro led spearheads out to drive back the foe, to no avail. Finally, when the only thing left to the Crimson Fist was to sell themselves as dearly as possible, the Indomitus Crusade arrived in system, unlooked for, at the 11th hour. Rabute Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, looked upon the hordes of dead orcs left in the wake of the Crimson Fists and commended the chapter. Upon being summoned to the Primarch, Pedro was, understandably, nervous. He was expecting censure. He felt he had failed to defend his homeworld and needed to be rescued. The Primarch, seeing his trepidation, laughed aloud to think that anyone could think they'd failed against such odds. If anything, he had exemplified his father, and Rogel Dawn would be immensely proud of his son in blue armour. And with those words, Gilliman left him, commanding him to rebuild the Crimson Fists, for they will be required again. He hand-delivered Primaris reinforcements, a gift from the Lord Commander of the Imperium. Not just a gift, but also a burden and a promise. A burden in that they needed to be trained and integrated into the Crimson Fist's way of war, and a promise of the future. Whilst the Primaris Marines were inducted into the chapter, Kantor deployed veteran kill teams across the galaxy, much like the days of old. Specialists in Xenos hunting, they were routinely sent for vigils abroad with the Death Watch, where their experience in fighting outnumbered versus orcs was invaluable. Meanwhile, back on Rindsworld, Pedro did exactly what a good son of Dawn should do. He fortified. The last command Guilliman gave him was to make the Rindsworld an impenetrable fortress, to become such a stronghold that, if required, it could become the linchpin of the entire segmentum. So now, not just charged with rebuilding his chapter, he's rebuilding the segmentum. And as someone who's really enjoyed playing games like Command & Conquer back in the day, building forts is really cool. And so, Pedro's just playing like Minecraft on a big scale, and I'm a fan of that. So there we have it. That's why I think Pedro is one of the coolest models and chapter masters in 40k, even though he doesn't have quite as much written about him as Azrael or Dante. This was a really shallow dive into some of the lore around Pedro and 40k, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more, let me know. I've been Sam. See you next time.